Let's move on to the next session. For the next session, we'll be talking about the corrupt society, investigating scams and black money. We have Professor Arun Kumar continuing from the previous panel. Joining him are Mr. N. Ram, Chairman of the Hindu Publishing Group and author of Why Scams Are Here to Stay, and Mr. Rajiv Lochan, Managing Director and CEO of the Hindu Group's publishing business. If I could invite the speakers onto the stage, please. Thank you.
A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and wish each and every one of you happy Pongal, happy Sankranti. The previous panel spoke about the changing face of the nation, and indeed the nation has changed quite significantly over the last several decades. I thought for purposes of this discussion, I would use literally the lifetime I have had to spend on the planet and as an Indian as sort of a frame over the last 5 decades, how the nation has changed. And I dare say look at the next 2.5 decades that I might be on this planet as an exploration of what is to come. Certainly if I look back, we have grown and prospered as a country by any stretch of the imagination. In 45, 50 years ago, we were probably a $100 billion economy. Today, we are a $2.2 trillion economy. That's fairly significant growth, and the economists will do the compounded annual growth rate and give us a number which we will all fight about, depending on who wants to take credit and who doesn't. But as a citizen, I think the country has grown and prospered quite significantly over the last 5 decades. At the same time, it's also a little disconcerting that corruption has grown and grown perhaps much faster than we've grown as a country. To give you a sense, back in 1971, the Nagarwala scam, which was then the big scam of the country, was a 60 lakh rupee scam. 60 lakhs on a $100 billion economy. When I graduated college, Harshad Mehta was the big scam, and that was a 5,000 crore scam. The scams of the Gurmehar Kaur era, which is the contemporary times we're living in, are several tens of thousands of crores. We won't get into a debate of who's right and who's wrong, methodologies and so forth, but suffice it to say it's several tens of thousands of crores. And if I just look at the growth in the size of the scam as a citizen, when the economy grew from 100 billion to 2.2 trillion, the size of the scam in that 45, 50-year period has grown from 60 lakhs to several tens of thousands of crores, and that's just a disproportionate, unacceptable increase in the size of individual scams. And so I think as citizens, we do need to take pause and reflect on where we've come from, because I think where we are going is an indisputably prosperous era as a civilization and as a country, right? There can be no doubt that over the next 25 years, we will generate more wealth than we've generated in the last 50. I would dare say that over the next 25 years, we will generate more wealth than we've generated in the last 100 years. But that's just me, and we can debate the wisdom of my thinking. But the reality is there is going to be enormous prosperity that all of us will witness and the country will enjoy. But as this happens, if you look back at the journey we've traversed over the last 5 decades, the journey ahead, while it's prosperous, seems quite disconcerting as well. If we do nothing today on this business of corruption, inequity will likely increase, civil unrest will likely grow, and the size, magnitude, and intensity of scams will probably spiral out of control. So it is worth us, we the citizens of the country, to pause and reflect on where we've come from and really what we choose to do about this disease, this malaise called corruption. And to sort of use this panel as an opportunity to reflect, we couldn't have asked for 2 more eminent illustrious, distinguished individuals who, of course, need no introduction. Professor Kumar here is the foremost authority on black money and black economy in the country. He's written extensively about it. And of course, Mr. Ram here to my right probably broke the grand scandal in India with the Bofors, which he is renowned for, and has thought deeply and researched deeply about corruption and scams in the country. I'm going to use the books they've recently published as the basis for the conversation. It's I think, a rare opportunity for all of us to hear from them. And so let me sort of kick off the discussion. Looking back a little bit, and maybe Professor Kumar, you can kick us off. Where have we come from on this business of corruption and the black economy?
Okay. So black economy involves illegality and so do scams and corruption. But in a sense, corruption is where there's a quid pro quo in some form or the other. But black economy, by and large, doesn't necessarily involve a quid pro quo. So if I'm a doctor, I see 50 patients and I declare only 20 patients, nobody is bribing me something to only declare the income of 20 patients and not the remaining. And these examples can be multiplied to under-invoicing, over-invoicing that takes place very widely in international trade or at home. So we need to look at the broader phenomenon of black economy with corruption as one aspect of it. But of course, there's a two-way interlinkage. As corruption and scams have increased, the black economy size has increased. And as black economy has increased, corruption and so on has also increased. So as you rightly said, in 1955-56, we had Professor Kaldor, who came from Cambridge and estimated the size of black economy to be 4 to 5% of GDP. And now my estimate is it has gone up to 62% of GDP. So we're not talking about small sums of money. At the current rate of GDP, it means about 95 lakh crores of black income generated this year. Scams will be one aspect of that, but that's all. The second point I'd like to make in this context is there's a lot of misconceptions about black economy. The first is that black is all cash. This is not true. And that was the mistake that was made about demonetization, that was thought that black is all cash. If we squeeze out the cash, black will go. That is not the correct thing to do. Second misconception is that all the black money is abroad. And that's why the Prime Minister promised 3 lakh rupee per person, that he could get the black money back. Only 10% of the black incomes generated go abroad, 90% remain here. So that's the next point that needs to be. Third important point is we all think real estate is the generator of black income. I've shown repeatedly in my writings in the last 35 years that real estate is only the circulator of black incomes, not the generator of black income. So you have to generate your black income somewhere and then pay in cash when you buy property. But that's only a circulation of black income, not the generation. So we need to focus on where the generation of black income takes place. Then people say that black economy is beneficial to the economy because black economy means additional output. So you have a 62% additional output, so the economy is $2.2 trillion, or add $1.4 trillion, so the real economy is $3.6 trillion. But the problem is that black economy lowers the potential of the economy, and therefore the economy could have been actually $18 trillion today if the black economy had not been as large as it is today. We would have been roughly the size of the US economy, and our per capita income, instead of being $1,500, would have been about $13,000. Instead of being one of the poorest 30 countries, we would have been in the category of the rich countries, which is $13,000 and above. So therefore, in a sense, the potential loss to the economy is enormous. And the reason why the black economy leads to potential losses, it's like digging holes and filling holes. So what is digging holes and filling holes? You send one person to dig a hole during the day, and at night you send another person to fill the hole. So next morning you have zero output, but 2 incomes are earned. So this is activity without productivity, and that's why the inefficiency in the system grows. So that's another misconception that we have. Another misconception that we have is that India escaped the global crisis of 2007-8 because of the large black economy. Now, that also is incorrect. We escaped because of other fiscal reasons that the government took. One of the important things that people think about black economy is that we have very high tax rates, and that's why people don't pay taxes. What people need to remember is that in 1971, when Mrs. Gandhi was the finance minister, the highest tax rate was 97.5%. And including wealth tax of 2%, if you had an income of above 15 lakh rupees, then your tax rate was 102%. Not even 100, so you couldn't have more than 15 lakh rupee of income. From that, we've come down to 30%, So in a sense, high tax rate globally is not the reason why black income generation is there. Also, people think we have controls and regulations because of which the black income generation is there. And I've repeatedly argued that it's not controls and regulations, it's the illegality underlying controls and regulations. If you say controls and regulations are the reason for black income generation, what you're saying is a law is its own cause of violation. That means a law can never be implemented, which is not correct. And I can go on listing a few other things, but maybe we'll come back to that.
Sure. I just want to draw the audience's attention to a point that Professor Kumar made that hit me between the eyes. The black economy's magnitude. He mentioned 4 to 5% in the mid-70s. The Wanchu committee that was convened, mid-50s, sorry. The Wanchu committee that was convened in the mid-70s estimated about 8% of the GDP, which at that time was about $125 billion. So it's about $20 billion roughly, give or take, right? Today, he's estimating it at 62% of 2.2 trillion, which, as he pointed out, is $1.4 trillion. So the black economy has actually prospered dramatically in my lifetime on this planet, even more so than the formal economy. And I think that's worth pausing and reflecting on. But Mr. Ram, let me draw you in on the subject of corruption. If I look back at my lifetime, it seems to me that corruption has become a part and parcel of life. Whether it is the corruption with a big capital C, of major political scams or defense deals and so forth, or indeed the corruption with the little c, lowercase c, where you're bribing a cop or paying off a revenue officer or what have you. It just seems to be a part and parcel of life. It's come for many people to be an ethical and legitimate way of conducting life. Do you see it that way? Why has this happened?
I think corruption, it's well established that corruption is pervasive, it is omnipresent, and it is multifarious or diverse. In other words, it's become a normal, not a pathological condition of our society. The question is, who is culpable? Are Indians intrinsically corrupt? This question has actually been posed in many settings. I don't think so. There is an endemic part of corruption, but also the scandal of empire. I think you know what happened to Clive, Warren Hastings, Yale, for example. It was the scandal of empire. But they manufactured this thesis about the Asiatic corruption, including Edmund Burke and so on. But apart from that, what is to be done? I think it's not very useful to see corruption as a mode of social and moral behavior. Of course, moral campaigns against corruption are valuable in the sense they fuel outrage, they raise awareness. But at the end of the day, as we saw from Jayaprakash Narayan's unsuccessful campaigns in the 1970s and Anna Hazare's and also Arvind Kejriwal's campaigns, moral campaigns don't meet the objectives they seek out to achieve. So what is to be done?
But Mr. Ram, sorry to interrupt you, but before we think about what is to be done, what do you see as the persistent failures? Because it seems to me the governors of free India have actually outdone our colonial governors, just in terms of the loot and the plunder. And while Shashi Tharoor has documented quite well, and several others have done a quite good job, it just seems to me we are being plundered today. Why is that? What are the persistent failures in your study and analysis that indicate the reason why we've come to such a sorry state?
The fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. That we are underlings, masters as well as underlings.
Yeah.
I think there are many determinants of corruption, many sources of corruption. That's why it's diverse. It is a normal condition. And I think the answer is to be found in the political economy of India. Political corruption is not the fountainhead of corruption, as is often proposed, as is often theorized. Political corruption is a function of the political economy of India, and I think that's what. And let me also say, how do you explain this? Drawing inspiration from rent-seeking theory, many economists and also corruption theorists said that when deregulation would occur, light-handed regulation and so on, corruption would gradually decline and fade away. Precisely the opposite has happened. I cite the 28 scandals that Suktankar and Vaishnav have listed, and there's been an exponential increase in corruption in the era of liberalization and globalization, and that, I think, speaks eloquently to what has actually happened. It has disproved the theory. Of course, it's not easy to explain why it has happened, but my understanding it is deep-seated in the political economy of India. It ties up with Professor Arun Kumar's thesis. He and I have, there are many common things, as he has pointed out. corruption is not synonymous with black money or the black economy, but they are enmeshed. There's a very close connection. There are many sources, but I contest the proposition that it's political corruption that is the fountainhead of corruption. It's the political economy that generates and reproduces the determinants of corruption all the time, the incentives for corruption. But we can discuss it.
That's a very important nuance, the distinction between political corruption and the political economy that fuels the corruption. Professor Kumar, Mr. Ram highlighted or reiterated your view that corruption and the black economy are tightly enmeshed, but are actually quite separate. And at least in your book, you make a compelling argument that the black economy is largely an outcome of an unholy nexus between the triad. Professor Kumar argues the corrupt politician, the corrupt business person, and the corrupt executive, the unholy nexus between these three parties. And in the executive, he includes the judiciary, the police, and the bureaucracy. When this unholy nexus comes together, and when you pour in it, the media and certainly criminals, it generates a potent cocktail. And that, essentially, you argue, is at the core of your black economy. Just dimension this for us so that we can wrap our heads on whether, is this a substantial issue? Are we just making this, too much of an issue where there is none? Just help us dimension a little bit how big this is.
As I said, the black economy is now 62% of GDP, according to my estimate for 2012-13. No further estimate has been made, so I'm assuming it's still 62%, but was growing very rapidly, so it should have grown further. However, if we still stick to 62%, what it implies is that in 62% of economic activity, there's illegality. Now, how can illegality be so large? That's the question. It can only be when the instrumentality of the state is a party to it. So in other words, the policymaker and the executive have to be a party to it before it can be systematic and systemic. So when I studied the sugar industry, I studied other industries, etc., what I found was that there's a system by which the black economy operates. So when the sugar cane comes into the factory, when the sugar is extracted, when the sugar goes out of the factory, there are manipulations taking place. And that is put in place before anything else happens. So in other words, you can lower tax rates, you can reduce controls, but because the system's already in place, it'll happen. So in other words, it is the political economy, as Ram very correctly points out, where the drive is to generate incomes over and above what you can generate legally. And why is there? That is because there's lack of social consensus on policies. So, for instance, in the 50s and the 60s, we went in for policies of austerity because the nation needed to move fast. Resources had to be mobilized for rapid development. So, consumption was constrained. So, these are all the things that prepared the ground, the political economy ground for corruption to grow, for the black economy to grow rapidly. And what has happened is that the black economy I've shown is concentrated in the hands of at most 3% of the population. So, 97% may be involved involuntarily in the black income generation process, but it's the 3% which drive the black income generation. And therefore, the inequality in the country is because of this 3% having a 62% extra income. And that has further implications in terms of the political economy, because then these vested interests build up. A part of the vested interest is when the capital is taken out through flight of capital, and that capital then moves back through round tripping into the country, and that further then influences the stock market and further influences the investment pattern in the Indian economy. And that then again has a political influence. And then as B.V. Kumar in his book pointed out, that the criminal entered the nexus after 1983. B.V. Kumar was the customs intelligence chief. And he wrote a book in 1990 pointing out that 1983, when criminals were given an amnesty, the smugglers and so on, they started entering politics. So what happened earlier, politics was being helped by the criminals, but now criminals directly entered. So either the businessman is a criminal or the politician is a criminal, And so criminalization of our politics has taken place in a very big way. And all this is linked, as Ram correctly points out, to the political economy, to the current situation. And as he rightly points out, that in spite of liberalization, or because of liberalization, black income generation further grew. So post-1991, the growth of black income generation has been very rapid. Flight of capital has been very rapid, as the data suggests. So in other words, we need to really focus on the political economy of the country to know how to tackle it in the future.
Mr. Ram, I can't resist asking the role of media in all this.
Yes.
Yeah, you have, of course, personally broken the grand Indian scandal, as you highlight in your book. But of course, the media has played a very central role in many more recent scandals. But equally, it is, I think, fair and appropriate to say the media is not entirely guilt-free. And there's been increasing peddling of influence, paid news, a variety of dubious roles that the media has played. Your thoughts on how much of a role the media has played in boosting corruption, so to speak?
I have, to some extent, highlighted this role. The media, there is deep-seated corruption within the news media in India, within the structures of the news media. And paid news is only something, a sort of scam that came to the surface. It is quite endemic. It's not just during election season that paid news occurs. It happens round the year in many other contexts. And the point is, yes, the media, I think the press in particular, the printed press, has had an honorable role, not just now, but going back 100 years in investigating and exposing corruption. It also gives them a lot of legitimacy and public support when they do this. In the case of Bofors, it involved only 64 crores, peanuts compared with 21st century scandals, the scale of it, and yet it had such a powerful impact. It's not just the media which investigated it. Don't forget VP Singh and others within the system who blew the whistle on it first, and also what happened in Sweden. But that is grand corruption. So the media gain from investigating and writing about corruption, but suborned media, and it's not just bribery and embezzlement and so on, it's being corrupted in various ways. Suborned news media have no credibility, have no legitimacy in investigating and exposing corruption at large. And I think this has to be recognized, it needs to be cleaned up. It has become almost intractable, even in the media. And I think unless we recognize it and even proclaim it in festivals like this, nothing much is going to happen.
God, let me build on that theme of cleanup. And maybe we can shift gears and look ahead a little bit. Both these gentlemen in their books have a very useful set of prescriptions and remedies that they've articulated. But I think both of them, it's fair to say that both of you argue there are no silver bullets, there are no shortcuts, there are no easy answers. So maybe, Professor Kumar, you can lead us off. Where would you start? What's the next step for us to decisively get our hands around the black economy and corruption? Okay, and then I'll come to you, Mr. Ram.
Yeah. So I think we need to step back a little and see that there have been at least few dozen committees and commissions that have looked into the various aspects of black economy, starting with 1948 and then Caldor in 55, 56, Santhanam in 64, Vanchu in 1970, Dagley Committee, P.C. Alexander Committee, and so on and so forth, to the latest three committees whose reports have not yet been released. Because there's disagreement amongst the three reports. So Pranab Mukherjee promised that it would be released at the time of the 2012 budget, but still not come out. And I think this government is also not able to do it. Now, these committees and commissions have made thousands of suggestions, including lowering tax rates, reducing controls, voluntary disclosure schemes, and a variety of other such things. So thousands. And we've implemented hundreds of them. But very often they've been counterproductive. So say, for instance, voluntary disclosure scheme, of which we've had 6 schemes. The 6th was in 1997, which was very successful. We got 11,000 crores of taxes, 33,000 crores of incomes declared. But the CAG report on the voluntary disclosure scheme 1997 said that people have become habitual tax offenders as a result. Because you expect a scheme to come, so you generate more black money today so that you can whiten it when the next scheme comes. So therefore, that was the first characterization. Second characterization of the CAG was that it's leading to honest people becoming dishonest, and it's very clear why that happens. The dishonest person is not paying taxes, his capital is rising. The honest person is paying taxes, the capital is rising less, so after a while he says, am I the only fool, and also turns dishonest. So many of these things have actually not helped and been counterproductive. So in other words, the problem is not narrowly technical. It's not that, we can do this, that demonetization will do this, or that, this voluntary disclosure scheme will help, or the reduction in taxes will help, or the reduction in controls and remedies will help. The question is the political economy question, as Ram has been repeatedly saying, and this triad. Unless you break the triad, then this will not happen. So how do you break
Where do we start, sir?
Yeah, so you have to bring in accountability, the accountability of the three wings of the triad that I said, the political class, the business class, and the executive. And one of the key things about that accountability is, how do we make the politicians accountable? Through the election process. Unless the election process gets cleaned up, there's no solution to it. If you need business accountability, then the accountability to the shareholders has to be made more this thing. For the executive, again, accountability requires right to information. So right to information is needed. So in other words, what I've done is I've broken up the solutions into three: the long term, the medium term, and the short term. There's very little you can do in the short term unless it is structured within the long term. So what we've been doing are short-term measures, and they have not really managed to help. But there are a few things that can be done immediately. Like, for instance, we know where the Hawala takes place from. Hawala houses can be stopped very quickly. The government has intelligence about Hawala houses, but Hawala is not stopped. In 1991 Jain Hawala case, as you know, what happened? 52 politicians' name came out, but nobody got prosecuted. The Central Vigilance Commission took over the charge of CBI. That also did not help, because none of these things are short-term measures. So in other words, these short-term measures like taking action against Hawala houses, banking secrecy is very important, as we've seen in the HSBC case, in the LGT case, and the other. It's stolen data that has come, but what it also shows is how our formal banking is involved in Hawala operations. So banking secrecy needs to be done. Then we need the direct tax code to be changed, so that we can simplify our direct taxes. GST and direct taxes code were mentioned at the same time. GST has come, but direct tax code, nothing has come on that. So they are very short-term steps which can have a limited aim, a limited goal, but it has to be structured in the long term of building accountability of oral structures.
Yeah. So, Mr. Ram, let me draw you in, your views on where we start the reform process.
Yeah, I start with the proposition that corruption, and also political corruption, is intractable under the present circumstances, which means unless you make deep-going and radical changes in the political economy, you can't prevent or eliminate it. Having said that, you cannot wait for that to happen, a revolution to happen, or radical changes. You've got to treat it as a problem here and now. These two seem to be in conflict, but actually they are both necessary. And I have thought of action, what is to be done under 9 heads. I'll just list the heads. Not elaborate on them because there's no time. One is action on the legislative front. The main anti-corruption law, the Prevention of Corruption Act, doesn't deal with, deals only with public servants, not with others. The second one is the Lokpal and Lokayukta Act. It's not been given effect to yet, although the Supreme Court has repeatedly reminded the government. The third, the Whistleblowers Protection Act, has not been notified, and there is an attempt to dilute these acts. So there is clear, India is a party to the UN Convention Against Corruption, which I think is quite good. For example, it deals with bribery by foreign public officials. It deals with compensation for the victims of acts of corruption, and it also deals with private sector corporate corruption. These are not covered by our main anti-corruption laws. That's one, the action on the legislative front. 2, action needed to overcome the lack of enforcement capacity. I won't go into it, but just to give an example, we don't have enough police officers, we don't have enough government servants, we don't have enough judges from the subordinate to the high court level. This is well substantiated, and in comparison with other countries, whether it's the United States, UK, China, Russia, etc., we are understaffed, not overstaffed. This is clear. 3, need for stricter, cleaner, and more effective regulation. Regulatory complexity is not the issue. Regulatory misconduct, as Arun Kumar has pointed out, is the problem. There is need for better regulation, not just re-regulation. 4, raising the visibility of corporate and private sector fraud. Surveys have shown that it's on the increase. 5, reforming and cleansing political finance and electoral funding. It's a huge subject. I just won't go into it, but it's a major source. And then the need for judicial accountability in adjudicating corruption. I don't deal with judicial corruption, which is a huge problem. And the latest letter and press conference by the 4 judges has called attention to the question of integrity. But I am not competent to deal with it, but that needs to be researched. What I'm concerned here with, the delays of the law, when there's a criminal case involving alleged corruption, judicial non-accountability is often the culprit. Take the Jayalalitha case, 18 years before it is decided, and so on. So the need for judicial accountability in adjudicating corruption cases. 7, the need to develop capabilities to investigate, to anticipate and prevent corruption. We have the technology and the tools these days, data mining, data visualization and so on. They can be more effectively used. And red flags can be raised over certain transactions, just as you would do in corporate, in a corporate context. And I think it can be used very effectively. Although Kautalya said in Arthashastra, one of the famous statements in the, which has gone into the international anti-corruption literature, just as you cannot say when a fish moving in water actually drinks it, you cannot say when government servants who are in charge of undertakings misappropriate money. So this is a timeless statement and is part of the international literature. But I think you have the technology and tools today to do something about it. And finally, political education and political mobilization as the key. But I cannot end on a very optimistic note. It is an intractable problem, but you can't let it be.
So for the benefit of the audience, let me make sure I've got all this right. One, you're saying it's just grown disproportionately and exponentially, this notion of corruption and the black economy. We seem to have a reasonable grasp of some of the persistent failures that have caused us to get here. Yet it seems to have become part and parcel of our lives. It's intractable, as Mr. Ram has reinforced about 4 or 5 times in the last 20 minutes. But something must be done about it. Lots and lots of people have, wiser minds certainly than me, have applied themselves over the last several decades to propose solutions. But the solutions are either limiting or have been applied or implemented in part, and has left us now in a state where it's essentially national muscle memory. Corruption and the black economy is part and parcel of our muscle memory. That's basically what I'm concluding. Let me maybe open it out to the audience for a few questions, and then I have one final question that I'd like to ask both of you to close this panel. On the questions, though, I would request you to raise your hands. We'll get a mic out to you. If you can identify yourself and identify who on the panel you'd like to ask the question to. And one last request, please keep it very brief and to the point. We'd like to get as many audience questions as possible. And I will reserve the right to cut off a long-winded speech with no question in sight. Yeah? Okay, we'll start with the gentleman out here in the front, sir.
I'm Dr. Rajendran, a retired professor.
It's working now, sir.
Yeah, is it working? Right.
Yes.
People don't like corruption. We have not talked much about corrupt leaders. But people like corrupt leaders. Is it not an oxymoron? How to prevent this?
I think you should take this, Mr. Ram. We seem to glorify corrupt leaders, admire them.
That's not quite true. It's just that corruption is only one facet that people look at. You take the case of Tamil Nadu. In fact, I have a chapter on the Tamil Nadu scientific system of political corruption, where it's rule-bound and rate-bound. I think other states also have it. But it is also a welfare state. it also has a public distribution system that is universal and works, and so on. So I think put corruption in its place. It's not the only issue on which people judge their leaders, but there are times when it becomes a huge issue. It happened to the UPA government at the center. It happened to the Jayalalitha government on one previous occasion after the mother of all marriages, remember? Even she lost her seat. So at times it becomes a major issue, but you have reminded us that not that people want corruption, but they put corruption in its place. And they probably feel there are worse things that happen in society than corruption itself. So, in other words, moral campaigns against corruption, if they remain merely moral campaigns, will not work.
People also don't have choices in a sense. If you look at Punjab, the Akali Dal comes to power and arrests the Congress leader. Congress comes and arrests the Akali Dal leader. Similarly, here you have the DMK coming to power and arrest the Anna DMK, and the Anna DMK coming arresting the DMK leader. You go to UP, you go to any state, so people don't really have a choice. The choice in the political leadership today is between Tweedledee and Tweedledum, as I have written repeatedly. The second is that when honest people do stand, like say Arun Bhatia in Pune, who was transferred 27 times in his 33 years career as IAS officer. And when I asked him, he said, 6 years I was not transferred because 3 years I was in Malaysia and 3 years I was in Botswana land. The remaining every year he caught, wherever he was posted, he caught somebody and he was transferred, He stood in Pune, even though in Pune there was a movement to bring him back because he was transferred out, but he got only 50,000 votes. Because in a sense, people want their leaders to also do their dirty work. The honest person would not do their dirty work. So there is somewhere an expectation that I want my leader to do this kind of work. So, when NGOs which have done very good work, they have stood, they have not got elected. So there is a certain degree of truth in what you say, that there's an expectation of the population. But as Ram said, it's not just about this, but it's about so many other things. What are the things that you want? In UP, when you go to the Thana, who's the person, who's the SHO? Would he help me or would he be against me? So those kind of expectations are also very strong.
No, it's a sad indictment.
Raji, if I may just add something, because it's an interesting question. There's something called the folklore of corruption. There's a whole stock of it. And Gunnar Myrdal in Asian drama was one of the first to use this term and actually to analyze its significance. There's a folklore of corruption and the reality of corruption, and there's a gap between the two. So when a politician who's seen to be corrupt comes along, he or she becomes part of the folklore of corruption. And so you've got to see it in that context.
Yeah, fair enough. The one sad indictment is that we all instinctively laughed when Arun Bhatia was not transferred for those 6 years when he was not in India. I think that speaks to the muscle memory that we've all inherited. There should have been shock and awe, right? Yet we all laughed. And that's quite a sad indictment on us as citizens.
As is the ruler, so are the people. Mannan evvadi, mannuyar avvadi. I can't tolerate blaming the people. They are driven to it, actually. They cannot escape from it. There are terrorists by those people. Sir. This is my question. Question is with answer. I may not be willing to take this lanjam, but I cannot escape from paying it for an honest need. How to put an end to it?
For Mr. Kumar's benefit, lanjam is bribe. So he won't take the bribe, but he's forced to give the bribe. How do you put an end to this?
No, so as I said, the black economy is systematic and systemic. It's not for the individual. The individual can't break out of it. And therefore, unless there's a larger political reform, the individual will remain a victim of this. So that's a very brief answer to it.
Thank you. Mr. Sriram here, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the back.
Sriram V, and my question is to Mr. Ram. We have yet another manifestation now of anybody daring to criticize the government getting all the anti-corruption arms descending on them the next day, with the perception that the person is already corrupt. Would you like to comment on that? Don't you think that's a manifestation of the same corruption in society?
Yes, the anti-corruption arrangements are being misused, whether you talk about the income tax department, the CBI, or the enforcement directorate. Sometimes they go after people who are complicit or who are corrupt. But it's selective targeting, and that is, whether you want to call it corruption or misuse of power or abuse of power, that's up to us. But I think that's an important aspect of this. In fact, demonetization, on which Arun Kumar is the leading expert, it happened. What came of it at last? Now there's scope for harassment of people. All the stocks have returned maybe 100% or more of what was estimated.
Yes, more, yeah.
But there is scope for harassment, and political opponents are being targeted. Some of them are culpable. There's no question about it. We know that. But why are the others who are equally culpable or believed to be culpable exempted from these investigations? And I want to raise the issue of NDTV here. Being from the media, it's being attacked in a fraudulent way. I don't think any evidence has been produced on money laundering or the various things they were accused of. But the process is the punishment. Nothing is going to happen at the end of the day, I can guarantee you that. But they are being targeted, and so are political rivals. And people like a certain former chief minister in Karnataka, whom I won't name, he has been under investigation, but nothing seems to have happened to him.
Very good morning to you, sir. See, I have always observed very stinkingly wealthy are corrupt. I am using not wealthy, very stinkingly wealthy. Okay. Now, I'll come, before you ask me what is your question, I'll myself tell you that.
Thank you.
Okay, now see, why does a man want his sister-in-law's, niece's, grandmother's, uncle's daughter? Why should he save money for them? He has 2 cars, okay, buy 3 cars. You have 2 bungalows, okay, buy 3 bungalows, go ahead.
Sir, you should address this question
No,
to that person.
Yes, please listen to me. Sometimes a question can be longer than an answer, please listen.
Sir, unfortunately,
Please, sir.
There is only limited time.
Sir, I'm just telling you, it is,
Get ready,
see, if a man, the only way we can do is, a wealthy man, he must have his son stand and see this son hold a dagger in his hand and hold a great nib in his hand every morning and decide which he wants his son to become. The question is, what I have said, is it right or wrong, sir? Thank you.
I will take the liberty of answering the question. You're absolutely right. And I would urge you to implement it in your life to start with. Yeah? Thank you. Thank you, sir. Let me go there.
I would like to understand from the panelist, either of the panelists, that what is the role of the technology in Indian context when we are in the transition phase, particularly when India is not that averse to written documents. We are very poor in written documents or documenting things and real-time things in the context of younger generation coming takeover, because technology is adopted and used more by a younger generation. And in the transition phase, to arrest the black money or to have a new form of economy, we are in the rapid, real-time, transparent and very, you mean to say, how technology can be enabled or useful for arresting or curbing the black money rather than going forward, looking forward thing in the Indian context, and also in the context of Bitcoin, which is emerging trend.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, technology has always been used to try and curb black income generation. When PAN cards were introduced, that was also a technological innovation. It was assumed that, now all the data would get under one head and therefore it would help. But it's the man behind the technology that's also very critical. So for instance, when you have electricity meters in Delhi, which were turned into electronic meters, what happened was that the linesman could come and fix your meter to be running fast or slow, unless you bribed him. So the position shifted, Similarly, you have mobile telephony that has come. Earlier, the linesman used to rule our lives and we used to give him bakshish of 20 rupees, 30 rupees in 1970s and 80s. Now the mobile telephony has come. You can get your phone automatically. But the entire amount that was earned by all the linesmen, far more was lost during the auction of the 2G spectrum. So in other words, technology only shifts the place where the corruption takes place. So my argument at technology has been that we need to really focus on the individual. We have to build a society. So it's the citizen who's important. So it is how do we get the citizen to do the right thing? Technology can be an aid in that, but technology by itself will not help.
So far as technology in relation to corruption is concerned, there's a literature which shows that mere transparency and technological tools are not going to help, are not going to do the job for you preventing and eliminating corruption. It depends on social and political will also. For example, Suktankar and Vaishnav have studied this, and Transparency International's single focus on transparency, accountability and so on is helpful, but it's inadequate to deal with the intractability of corruption.
Both their books are extremely well researched and eloquently written. They're written for a non-technical audience as well. So I found it quite instructive, and I'd encourage you to pick a copy up. The conclusion in this, and I think Professor Kumar put it very well, I think we as citizens need to take the matter in our hands. If we choose to do this, then I think there is a glimmer of hope and a chance for all of us as citizens of the country to prosper. If we continue the muscle memory that seems to have afflicted us over the last several decades, then it does look like the intractability that Mr. Ram spoke about will become a way of life for future generations. I hope each and every one of us will have the guts and the courage to do the right thing for the country. Thanks for being a wonderful audience, and enjoy the rest of the festival.